Okay, everyone. So to deliver on the promise of practical Kabbalah, I want to get into a series of patterns that we see throughout the universe, not just in the big picture, but in the small picture as well. So I want to start with a big question, and then I want to move into some smaller questions and see how this framework, the structure that we're going to explore today, is going to answer up a lot of questions about how the universe works. Okay? And in addition, it's going to answer questions about how do we work. So the big question that I want to ask is, I hinted to this last time, how is it that God is everything? In other words, when we say the Shema, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, God is one, it doesn't just mean that there is one God and not two. It means that God is a unity. It means that He is all-encompassing. There is nothing that exists outside, and God is not divisible. He has no parts. So how is it that God is the entirety of all being, and at the same time, Sammy, you are not God? Yeah, it's a letdown, right? It's like the oracle telling Neo he's not the one, right? Oh, I thought I was God for a second, right? There's this syndrome in Jerusalem called Jerusalem syndrome. Have you heard of it? Yeah. Where people who have certain mental tendencies come to Jerusalem and they think that they are Mashiach. They think they're the Messiah. And it happens a lot. So sometimes it can come as a letdown that you're not the Messiah, but you're also not God. And I don't think that anybody here was surprised by the fact that you're not God. But it's a real existential question, which is, how is it that God is everything and yet I'm not God? That's the big question we're going to start with. So I'd like to know, any takers? What are your initial thoughts? How would we resolve this paradox? Well, let me give you a hint. Albert Einstein once said that if I had 1 hour to solve the world's problems, I would spend 50 minutes working on the question and 10 minutes figuring out the answer. Because once you have the question really, really down pat, then the answer comes more easily. So what exactly is the question? Was that harder than the first question?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so let's make it really, really clear. There is no, when we talk about God, one of the words for God we use is actually hamakom. Anyone ever been to a shiva? Right? You say in a shiva, hamakom yenachem etchem, right? God should comfort you. And oftentimes in the Pesach Haggadah, you will see God referred to as hamakom. So what does hamakom mean? The place. He is the place. So oftentimes people say, is God in the world? And the answer is no, the world is in God. In other words, God does not exist in space. He is all of time and space. It all exists inside of Him. He is the fabric of reality. And so when we talk about existence, that can only happen when we say there's something, God is the fabric of all of existence, and the things exist inside of Him. So that's the Jewish perspective of God. It's the monotheistic perspective of God. It's the understanding that there is no room or space for anything outside of God. Yeah? So if God is the fabric of all of existence, then that means that God is here and God is there and God is truly everywhere.
Up, down, down.
You got it. Left, right, A, B, start. That was the cheat code for Nintendo when we were kids, right? So I just always think about that when I hear that song. Yeah. Those two should not really go together, but okay, fine. The mind works in strange ways. So therefore, that should mean that God crowds out the possibility of anything else existing. So our existence is actually an impossibility. That's what I'm asking. We can't exist because there's no space outside of God for us to exist.
There's space inside.
Okay.
No, but
good.
We're still inside God. So what's
Exactly.
inside us?
Yeah.
is inside
Now
God.
hold on a second. Let's make the question even more difficult, which is I also told you, Isaac, that God, being a oneity, a unity, is indivisible. He has no parts. Now I look around at this universe and I see a lot of things broken up into a lot of different parts. right? Nikita might be next to you, but he's not you, right? Now, even within inside of you, you're made of multiple parts, aside from your limbs and your organs, right? Even in the parts of you that are closest to a singularity, right? Let's say you, Isaac, your mind. Well, is your mind made up of lots of parts?
Yes.
Yeah. There's memory, and there's imagination, and there's your will, right? And then there's the part of your mind that deals with the senses, eyesight and touch and taste, all of those things. So we can break down almost everything about you into smaller parts. And yet, God is not made of any parts. So what are we? Where are we? Where do we fit in that equation that does not handle, cannot be so well?
Can I take a guess?
Yeah.
Is it that we're defining him as defining the idea of parts as wrong? It's because we would say that God is omniscient and benevolent, but we wouldn't say his omniscience and his omnibenevolence are parts of him, like staccated parts of him. We would say they're just aspects of his character. So in that sense, could you say that we are like slithers of God's character?
Yeah, so this is where it's going to get really tricky. So first of all, just to answer that, this is an interesting way to just jog your minds and to kind of comprehend what is not comprehensible. So the Baal Shem Tov, who founded the Hasidic movement in the 18th century, says that if you really want to blow your mind a little bit about how it's impossible to understand the divine, think like this. If God has no parts, then what that really means is that God's memory is his imagination, is his will, is his eyesight. Now, what on earth does that mean? That's totally just nonsensical to us in any sort of human language, right? We know very clearly that my memory and my imagination are two totally different things. And my memory and my will are apples and oranges, right? What I want is not what I remember. And so to try to understand the unity of God is just, it will sizzle your circuits, right? So we really, really don't know what we're talking about when we talk about the unity of God, but we still are confronted with the problem that in the face of that unbelievable, incomprehensible unity, there's us. So how do we fit? So the answer is going to be, it's a little bit of a magic trick. And what I mean by that is we're not going to resolve this paradox. It's a paradox that lies at the heart of Kabbalah, of the writings of the Arizal, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, who was the founder of the grandfather of modern Kabbalah, right? The Zohar, which is the esoteric, the mystical text that interprets the Torah, according to rabbinic tradition, has been around for thousands of years. Rabbi Luria lived 500 years ago, but he was really the first person to decode the entirety of the Zohar. And really, at the heart of his writings is how do we exist? How on earth does anything exist when God is everything? Okay? Yeah. So what does that mean? So tzimtzum is just a jargony word for contraction, right? In some sense, God contracted himself. So in order to get a handle of this paradox, in order to appreciate the paradox, a lot of times, like we said last week, the information that we are dealing with here is not the same sort of propositional knowledge that we normally get in university. We can't memorize facts. This isn't like a logic puzzle. This is oftentimes going to end up in a paradox, and the knowledge or the wisdom that we gain is the ability to appreciate and see how the paradox fits together. Because we, my friends, live in a three-dimensional world, but when we're dealing with categories and ideas that exist in the fourth dimension, to us it's going to seem like a paradox. It's going to seem like the two can't ever be reconciled, right? So let's do it. Let's do it. So the beginning of all of creation involves two different energies, two different forces that come into the world. All right? The moment after the unity that we can't really comprehend is this duality. There's a reason why the Torah There's a lot of midrashim and a lot of stories that talk about why the Torah starts with a bet, the second letter of the alphabet. And at the heart of that is because we can't understand the aleph. That's why an aleph, by the way, has no sound, because oneness is totally ineffable. You can't speak it. You can't comprehend. Bet, the letter 2, is where we begin. That's where our story begins. We begin in a universe of duality, of God and the creation, right? Of God and something else. That's where our story begins. So these two forces exist in the universe, and they are characterized by two polarizing, but at the same time, complementary powers. And these are the two forces that keep all of existence in alignment. Now, this is going to start high, but you'll see very clearly how this is going to have very, very practical applications. So these two forces are often described as two things called chesed and gevura. Who's heard of those before? All right, so let's start with chesed. What does chesed mean?
Kindness.
Yeah, so on a, let's say, human character trait level, chesed means kindness. Now, what does kindness mean? What is kindness?
Being kind to other person, like.
Yeah, you can't use the word in the definition, Nikita. Kindness. Can you use it in a sentence, right?
But that's actually what it means.
So what is kindness? What results in kindness? Let's say it like this: if kindness is the result, then what is that inner quality that causes a person to want to do kindness? Yeah.
I would say empathy.
Okay, empathy. Good. Now it's interesting because in Kabbalistic language, kindness and empathy are two different words, right? Kindness is chesed and empathy is rachamim, yeah, or compassion, yeah. And they're actually coming from two different places, and that's a really deep idea which we spoke about on Pathfinders, right? Is because there's two different ways of giving, right? One is you give because you empathize, you see or you feel the pain of someone outside of you. Chesed, in its purest form, is simply the desire to give.
Selflessness.
It's not selflessness. It's not selflessness. It's actually the desire to want to expand. Chesed,
Like the universe.
it does sound a bit selfish. It is both selfish and selfless, and
Because-
we'll explain this. Yeah, but go ahead.
In acting on, I think we've spoken a little bit about free will, because in acting on a desire, ultimately you're doing something in your own self-interest.
Okay.
And also, to what extent do we really have control over the actions we take if ultimately everything is determined by a desire? Even the desire not to fall into the trap of following desires is a desire.
Yeah. Okay, good. That's very Buddhist of you, and it's true. Now, let's mold. No. This is the way in which we have to have this discussion, because we have to just kind of feel around, right? There's an expression that says the Torah is rich in one place and poor in another place, which means that sometimes you really can't understand one part of it until you understand everything else, which is impossible to know where to start. So let's explain it like this. Imagine you are a glass of water, right? And you're missing a little bit of water. So you have a desire, you have a need, because you are lacking. Right? We have needs because we're lacking. But imagine now, if you will, that you're a glass of water that's actually overflowing with water. You've got too much water. Now, in a certain way, you also have a need. You need to overflow and to spill onto other people, right? So if you are so full, then you have actually no choice but to want to seek to give over to other people, right? This is a really deep idea. So when we talk about this idea of giving simply to give, giving because you want to give, irrespective of the receiver, that may sound selfish, but it's actually more selfless than empathy. And the reason why, anyone? Why is empathy a slightly selfish deed?
Because you're relating someone's situation to your own, to something else you've experienced.
Okay.
And sort of
Okay, yeah, so you could say, oh,
And saying theirs is less than yours.
There's
Mm.
intrinsic pain with empathy.
Yeah. And therefore,
And therefore you're just trying to get yourself out of the pain.
when you empathize with somebody who is sleeping out in the cold tonight, what do you feel? You feel, oh my God, I'm viscerally upset and sad and hurt by seeing this person. I want to end that suffering, but I also want to end some of my suffering as well. So this is a really interesting discussion about the difference between what's better, right? Chesed or rachamim, pure kindness or empathy, but not for now. But in any case, kindness, chesed, stems from simply the desire to expand, to flow over, to give over, right? And if we think about God, so that's often spoken about as the primary attribute of God, that everything stems from that. The desire to create comes from that force. So the beginning of all of creation begins with chesed. And thus there's a verse that says, Olam chesed yibane, the world is built on chesed. And that is taken both in the big picture and in the small picture, that we are enacting that desire to want to give and want to create and want to overflow all the time. But that's the only reason why anything exists. So when people ask the maybe bigger question, this massive philosophical question, which is, why does God need us in the first place? Which I think we'll answer in several sessions from now. One of the answers, and it's not the perfect answer, it's not entirely satisfying for reasons we'll go into later, is because God is a giver. He is a giver, intrinsically. That which is perfect, that which is completely whole, has a desire to give. Yes,
If
Rachel.
the attribute of giving and kindness and the attributes that we give to God, if these attributes are finite, how is it not problematic to anthropomorphize God in that way?
Yep, absolutely.
So what's the Jewish way around that?
So Maimonides has an entire philosophy called negative theology, where he basically says there is nothing you can say about God. You can only say what God isn't. Yeah. However, the Torah gives us a cheat code around this, which is that the Torah actually describes God with certain attributes.
Yeah.
Which means that, let's say you were to take white light and diffract it through a prism, right? So the white light is greater than any one of those colors. But through the prism, you could say that in that white light is blue, red, yellow, green, purple. Yeah? So the same thing is true, that God is above kindness and patience and perfection and all of those finite words but if you were to diffract that perfection and that wholeness through some sort of prism in time and space, you would get kind and just and fair and all of those things that are used to describe God.
It's the way a finite human mind can best attempt to
That's right.
define God.
Sammy, go ahead.
If you define kindness as an overflow,
Yeah.
wouldn't that make kindness it would make it a result of another action or a result of a state of being, which would sort of limit its, lack of a better term, goodness. How can kindness be a good action if it's simply the result of a situation in your life?
Involuntary.
Yeah, involuntary.
Because it's a good question. It's because it's the result of developing yourself to perfection or to close to it. In other words, I have to nullify my ego enough that I'm caring more about my desire to want to give to others than to only take care of myself.
Wouldn't that sort of make kindness an inherently selfish action?
So Rachel asked exactly that question about 10 minutes ago. And the answer is yes and no. And this is where it gets difficult. It's not a selfish action because the whole thing stems from simply the state of no longer looking inwards and no longer thinking about me and now only looking about others, right? That's what makes it selfless. But what I think that you're alluding to, and tell me if I'm wrong, is that it rubs us the wrong way that we're not mindful of the recipient in the state of kindness, in this chesed. It doesn't matter who you are, almost. If I'm giving purely out of chesed, I actually have no concern about what your actual needs are. I'm simply concerned with the fact that the highest good is to give. So I want to pause on that because this is a whole other route that we're taking that's incredibly important and fascinating, and that's why you are successfully dragging me into that digression. But I want to stay on track here. So if the first state, if the first quality of all of existence is this overpouring, outpouring of kindness, chesed, of desire to create and give and do, this expansiveness, we have one problem, which is that the expansion will never end. In other words, you can become so giving and so kind that you eclipse and overshadow the person you're giving to. If you, now let's make this really concrete. If you're a parent and you adopt the chesed-only approach, what do you think will happen to your children?
They'll become spoiled.
They will become totally spoiled, completely incapable of fending for themselves, of learning how to do anything, of any type of independence whatsoever. They'll have no identity outside of you, right? So you will devour those children. So in order to temper chesed, you need something else, which is what is going to help us contain that chesed so that it doesn't swallow up the recipient.
Wisdom?
Wisdom. What do you mean by wisdom?
Recognizing the dangers of giving too much and knowing when to step back and...
Okay, good. So you're exactly right, but I wouldn't call it that you're right. You need the wisdom to be able to know how to temper those two things together, but what you're really describing is the act of restraint.
Yeah.
Isn't
Restraint.
that just a different form of giving? You're sort of giving space or giving nothing rather than giving...
That's right. It depends. If it stems from, if your primary quality is giving, and then as a subcategory of that, you say, well, in order to be a great giver, I actually have to restrain myself sometimes, then yes. However, and this is where we're going to see the source of all evil comes from, is this attribute of restraint. Because restraint on its own is simply just cutting yourself off from the recipient. So these are the two primary colors, if you will, of all of creation. Chesed, which is giving, outpouring, kindness, expansiveness, but eventually that needs to be reined in, because if there's too much of God, then there's not enough of me. And oftentimes people say, well, why doesn't God just reveal himself to the entire universe? And the answer is, you would cease to exist. Either literally or functionally, right? Functionally, because you just wouldn't have any free will anymore. If everything is so obvious, every time you did a mitzvah, you'd get a $1,000 check in the mail. Every time you did something wrong, you'd get a zap of lightning. Like, we would never do anything wrong. We'd only do anything right, but we'd never get any credit for it. So what you need is a God who is kind enough that he wants to create us and sustain us and give us all the opportunities of goodness, but at the same time, one who is wise enough to be able to temper his existence enough that we have space to be ourselves, that we have space to acquire an identity through our own independent labor, through our own ability to seek that goodness and that wisdom. These are the two things that are in place in the universe, chesed and gevura. And of course, these are the two primary tools at the disposal of any parent or educator, is that that's exactly what you want to give to students. A person becomes a teacher, speaking from personal experience, because you feel a desire to want to share with other people what you know. You know, I'm so grateful for the teachers that I had, and I also realized that I didn't have that person in my life when I was 18 years old, and I would love to be that person for somebody else. But if all I do is sit down here at this table and say, let me just spew word garbage at you, right? I will just talk for an hour straight and you'll just sit there and be like, your faces will be suntanned from the amount of depth and wisdom and beauty that I have to share with you, right? So it's going to be, it'll be cool, maybe. It'll be a fireworks show. But you will have, first of all, you have done nothing to engage or participate. And second of all, it's probably too high for you anyway. If I were to just directly spew to you all, the 20 years of experience I have in this, as opposed to saying, well, let me take that and start from the aleph bet, yeah? So, therefore, Every parent, every educator has to know when to say, let me hold back, let me let you answer the question instead of me giving you the answers all the time. So this is where all of existence begins. Chesed, which is that desire to give, and then Daniel, as you very, very beautifully identified it, Gevura, right? Ezehu Gibor, who is a Gibor, who is a strong person? Someone who conquers their own inclination. In other words, strength, Gevura, is really defined as the ability to hold oneself back, not to be able to beat up other people. That's really what strength is. So we now look at a universe where I recognize that as kind as it is that the sun shines on my face and that fruit grows from trees and that there are infinite possibilities of achieving vast amounts of pleasure on this planet, there are things that are hard, that are extremely challenging. There are times where things seem not to be going my way, and all of these are a result of what a thinking person would say is the kindness of God's restraint, of holding back. I'm saying, I'm sorry, but if you want to be an adult, then I need to let go of the bicycle eventually, at some point. Okay, yeah, Sammy.
Just a quick question. I understand the idea of you have the God as restraint because if everything was easy, there would be no rewards in anything. But that idea stems from the way that God created the world. He created the world with sort of underlying principles of, struggle leads to reward. So if he's an omnipotent being, he could create a world where you could have infinite pleasure without needing to have the difficulty to achieve it. And whatever response you say to that of, well, actually, because you need this to achieve this, or it's all based on his own laws which he made in the first place. He's having restraint because of the system he put in place that you need to have restraint.
Okay, so what's so amazing about this group of people is that you're all so on the ball that you're all asking the best questions, and each of those questions deserves its own class, right? So the short answer is that, this is the very short answer, is that is the, it's the only way in which that can exist. This world is the only way in which we can achieve the highest level of pleasure. And the reason why is because there's only one way that we can never possibly be like God, which is that we never earned our right to exist. God exists of his own accord. He's not a created being, right? So he was never the recipient of anything. The greatest good is to be like God. But since we can't create ourselves, the next best thing that we can do is to earn our existence through effort. That's the next highest substitute to creating ourselves. So I'm going to pause there. Yeah. That's the short answer. So there's a lot more to talk about. Rachel, you wanted to go more down that route?
Okay. Another time.
Thank you for the restraint. That was good gevura in practice. So let's make this a little bit practical. Okay? So I already spoke to you about parenting, education. Most relationships require this type of giving and restraint. There's a very beautiful and very, actually, a bit of a dangerous passage in the Zohar that says that by Abraham, it never says that he loved his wife, Sarah. But by Isaac, it does. And everyone's like, what does that mean? Does that mean Abraham never loved his wife? And the answer is, of course he did. Of course he did. But the Jewish Torah's definition of love is of such a high caliber that there was something that Abraham was missing. So as we'll see maybe next session, Abraham and Isaac don't just represent people in history, they represent these qualities, these attributes. Abraham was the epitome of kindness, of giving, of expansiveness. Always doors open, always trying to be kind to people, even if they don't deserve it at all. So much so that he gave food to angels who don't eat. That's the level of chesed that he's at, where it's like, I just need to give. I just have to give. He's sitting outside his tent 3 days after he's had a circumcision at the age of 99, looking for people to do chesed too. And God says, I feel so bad for you that I'm going to give you people to do chesed too, because there's no one around for you to give to, right? That's the crazy part of that story. So Avraham, guess how he treated his wife? I have to give to you, right? You are the recipient of my kindness, of my giving. Now the problem with these Avraham-type personalities is, and you'll recognize some of these people walking around, is they are so generous and so kind all the time, but they don't always exactly stop to think about what the other person needs. They're very, very good at being givers, but a Yitzchak, who's the person who restrains himself, literally the binding of Isaac, that's what he's most good at, is holding back. Yitzchak, Isaac says, hold on a second, let me just create some space for you, right? Let me hold space, as people say, right? So Yitzchak was the first person to say, let me create enough room for you to exist that I actually know what it is that you want, so that I can listen to what it is that you want. And real, true love is only where that begins. So that's why it says that. It doesn't say Abraham loved Sarah, even though he loved her, but his love was, in that sense, slightly deficient, whereas everyone else managed to have that restraint that was part of love. Okay? So, so where does this lead us today? So there's a really, really interesting application that affects all of our society, and when you see this pattern being plugged in, you're like, oh my God, this is patently obvious. And the arena of human affairs that I'm talking about is politics. So we look at politics and we see these, usually what's broken down into two camps, major camps of politicians who are always arguing and fighting with each other about what the right thing is to do with the country. Depends on the country exactly what arguments they're making, but whether it's Democrats and Republicans or whether it's Tories and Labor, right? Thank you very much. Or whether it's hawks and doves or whatever it is, you name it, there is usually some group of people who are saying we need to help the poor and open the borders of immigration and give more in terms of in terms of social safety nets and work on education, and right? And then there's usually a group of people that say, whoa, we need to be fiscally responsible, and we need to make sure that we preserve the traditions and the institutions that have been working for now, and we need to be very, very measured and careful when we allow immigration, because too much can lead to, all sorts of bad things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Okay, and each person on one side of the aisle is going to obviously demonize whatever the view is of the other person on the aisle. But guess what the source is of this major dichotomy dispute in all of politics? It is, do you come from the source of chesed or do you come from the source of gevura? This is where it all comes from. And if you think about it for at least 5 seconds, you will realize that everything split perfectly down the middle is open, expand, how can I give, how can I share more? We need to open the borders, we need to give more tax cuts, we need to, or no, tax is the other side, right? We need to give more in terms of safety nets, right? We need to help and uplift and expand and reach out and hug everyone, right? And then you have all the Gevura people, aka the conservatives, conserve, to restrain, literally, which is, whoa, if you innovate too fast, you're going to ruin everything. If you open up, if you give too many social safety nets, then people won't. What's the argument? What? They won't work. They won't have an identity. They won't have a sense of independence. They won't work for themselves, right?
So you're saying we should vote with them?
Find that middle party. The answer is, well, in truth, the answer. So I want to read for you a quote from a 20th century philosopher, Bertrand Russell. Ever heard of Bertrand Russell? Okay, so Bertrand Russell says, "It is clear that each party to this dispute, as to all that persist through long periods of time, is partly right and partly wrong. Social cohesion is a necessity, and mankind has never yet succeeded in enforcing cohesion by merely rational arguments. Every community is exposed to two opposite dangers. Ossification, which means you get too rigid. Os is like as a bone for those French speakers, right?
It's Latin.
Yes, because French comes from Latin. You're right. Yes. You're right. You're right. It is Latin. You're right. She's more right than I am. It's true. The os is a Latin root for bone. Ossification through too much discipline and reverence for tradition. Who's that? The conservatives, right? On the one hand. On the other hand, dissolution or subjection to foreign conquest through the growth of an individualism and personal independence that makes cooperation impossible, right? You do you. You have freedom, right? You do everything that you want to do. You be your own, right? No social customs, no structures in place that are going to tell you what to do or think or feel, right? You just be yourself. Now, what's interesting is that the pendulum of history often swings one way to the other, and where do you think we are now?
We're giving everyone. No, I'm joking.
Well, where do you think we are? I would say that the predominant Western culture is far to the chesed side, right?
Are we talking about the current social situation or the government itself?
No, not the government itself.
Okay, sorry, I missed
Modern day society.
There's no question, first of all, by the way, that even conservative parties have moved way further left in the last 50, 60 years, right? Probably since the 1950s or so is when this shift began.
In the UK or in America?
Both.
What about the 1960s?
Yes, you're right. There are sometimes little pendulum swings back the other way, right? You can find plenty of examples where sometimes you go way too far and say, no, we're rebelling against that. But the overall trend throughout the last 7 or so decades has been further and further towards the chesed side. The breakdown of tradition, the breakdown of higher institutions and traditions of telling us that this is the right way to do something, so that today we say everything's game. I always think about this in terms of, you ever watch films from the 50s about the way people used to date, right? There was this and this was already in where things had loosened up a bit. We're not talking about like Victorian era courtship, which was incredibly ritualized. Already in the 1950s, it was like, well, first, he gives her his pin, and that's how they say that they're going steady, and then they hold hands, right? Like there's this very, very, very ritualized and organized manner of dating. Today, everything is game, right? There are no rules anymore. Now, which, by the way, is an unbelievably confusing thing for a human being. To live in a game where there's no rules, you're basically you're petrified. You're paralyzed. There's actually nothing to do. There's incredible amounts of confusion because the two of you are never on the same page. And we're now start to understand that a game with no rules is chesed without gevura, right? It's so much openness that you now don't even know what you're doing anymore. There is no pathway, there's no structure, right? It's the teacher saying to a group of kids in the classroom, we're going to just learn anything. And they're like, okay, well, let's go, let's start, let's learn anything. And they're like, well, but where do we begin, right? No, I don't want to limit you, right? I don't want to oppress you, right? So now we see today that most rules, most social traditions and customs today are seen as oppressive and are things to be overcome. So you'll see that there's small, slight countermeasures, but that's kind of what's happening. So you can take this incredibly deep kabbalistic theory of everything, all of the universe, this is how we exist, and you can plug that into so many different areas of your life. The way that our society works is built on this premise. Now, what Bertrand Russell understood was that you need both of these things in order to have a sustainable government, in the same way that you need both of these things in order to have a sustainable universe. Too much God, we don't exist. Not enough God, we all die, right? The same thing is true with the government. Too much innovation and change and openness. Everybody is, there's no cohesion and nobody works and there's no sense of structure at all. But too much rigidity, too much conservation, right? And then everything withers because you need to be able to innovate. You need to be able to adapt and be flexible. And sometimes you need to be compassionate when somebody falls through the cracks and it's not their fault, right? And a really wise person knows how to balance that. Which is why in the Talmud it says, and I quote, right, it should always be the left hand that pushes away and the right hand that draws near. Right? This is what we're constantly doing.
So the Hasidim wear the buttons that way, right?
Yeah, well, so that's what we'll talk about later, which is that Kabbalistically, the right side is always the side of giving and the left side is always the side of restraint. Right? So yes, you're right. Hasidim, they always want the chesed to overcome the gevura. So on most men's shirts, the left side of the shirt, it goes over the right side of the shirt. But on a Hasidic clothing, the right side goes over the left side. Right? Everything, by the way, everything they wear has deep symbolism. So it's really, really...
Yeah, I'm Hasidic.
Right, so there you go. No, you're wearing it. That's the non-Hasidic way of wearing it. It's the normal way, right? So they say, no, we want the right side to overcome the left side. Yeah?
Am I right in thinking this is the same as Aristotle's argument of balance between two extremes?
Yeah, but the question is, yes, so you will find, this is, by the way, this is not, the Torah speaks this out, and the deeper Kabbalistic sources really flesh this out and talk about the mechanism and the method by which these two things sustain the universe and where it plays out. But this is a universal idea. This is yin and yang, right? This is in the Hindu religion, this is Vishnu and Shiva, right? The creator and the destroyer, and they're two sides of the same coin. They're absolutely the same, right? So you'll find this everywhere. This is absolutely universal. But this is the basis. This is the beginning of it all, right? When we talk about existence cannot even be conceivable without these two forces at play. Because these are the things that are saying God is giving just enough for us to exist, but hiding himself just enough for us to exist. And to not be burned up by that light. So I'm sure there are plenty of other areas that we could go into where this example plays itself out. I have an example from Jonathan Haidt when he talks about evolutionary biology, and he talks about what it means to be an omnivore. Right? He says that omnivorous people, he says, there's something called the omnivore's dilemma, which is that you have an advantage of flexibility. You can wander into a new continent and be quite confident that you'll find something to eat. But it also has the disadvantage that new foods can be toxic, infected with microbes, or riddled with parasitic worms. So the dilemma is that omnivores must seek out and explore new potential foods while remaining wary of them until they're proven safe, right? That's what we do all the time as human beings. We venture out a little past our comfort zone, and then we get a little bit scared, and we go back into our shell, and then we do that dance back and forth, and that's how we explore and become new people. And he says you can basically divide people into effectively what are called neophiles, which is people who love what's new, and neophobes, which are people who are afraid of what's new. And if you want to know something really interesting, Jonathan Haidt, in this book, The Righteous Mind, which is one of my favorite books of all time, says that you can often determine what a person's political persuasion will be based on their psychological makeup, of how open to new experiences they are, or how resistant to new experiences that they are, which is crazy. Because we think that we're just making choices about what sounds like the best policy, but in reality it's just your psychology. It's like, are you just generally more open to doing new things, or are you a little bit more of a conservative person? So these are all of these factors at play. So now we have in our vocabulary we have chesed and gevura, and these two things you will start to notice will play out in every single area of your life. And if you're not careful, you'll just go crazy, like being like, oh, that's chesed, oh, that's gevura. Oh, that's, relationships. Usually there's one person that's more chesed and one person that's more gevura. It just, it usually happens that way. Human biology, these are how these things play out. Okay, any final questions, thoughts, comments, political speeches?
You chesed or gevura.
So,
Dominant.
yeah, so usually people talk about introversion and extroversion. I would say that I'm more of an introvert by nature. So I like to be alone. I like to do deep meditation and think about things in my own head. But I think by nurture, I have been socialized to be a gregarious person and to like being around other people. Yeah.
Good answer.
What do you think you are, Isaac?
Mix of both, right?
Well, okay, but usually you're more dominant in one than the other.
Probably more restrained.
Okay.
Yeah.
Classic
A classic Isaac, yeah, there you go, a classic Yitzchak. Very
That's
good.
where the name comes from, right?
Okay, you got
From
it.
you.
Yeah, they say that parents have a certain degree of divine inspiration when naming their children, so there you go.
Pretty true.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for joining me on this magical journey. Hope you enjoyed it.